Hello and welcome to the webinar today from Plant Grow Fly at Blank Park Zoo. My name is Jessie Lowry and I'm the Director of Conservation and Research here at the zoo. And I have my colleague here as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Angela Tague and I'm also part of the Conservation Department here at Blank Park Zoo as well as the Education Department.
We are so excited to present this webinar for you today, and Plant Grow Fly really fits into the mission of Blank Park Zoo, which is to inspire an appreciation of the natural world, education, research, and recreation. What we see the zoo as a window to the wild, a place where we can invite the community and schools to come in and see the amazing animals that we have to offer here at Blank Park Zoo and feel that sense of awe that we all feel when we see the animals. But we want to turn that sense of awe into a real conservation action, something that's actually going to make a difference to wildlife and wild places around the world. And that's why we created Plant Grow Fly. So today at this webinar, we are going to talk about the ecological benefit of pollination. We're going to meet the main pollinators in Iowa. We're going to talk about the importance of pollinators, what is happening with the decline of pollinators, and really what we can all do to help by planting pollinator habitat and other pollinator-friendly practices. We will start to close by talking about the most recognized insect in the world, the monarch butterfly, and we're going to sprinkle some quiz questions throughout to make this webinar interactive for you that are watching today, and we're so glad that you joined us. So let's go ahead and get started.
Can't wait.
Over the years at Blank Park Zoo, we have worked on over 50 wildlife campaigns on saving animals in their range countries, like the big charismatic megafauna, like lions that you see here, like rhinos, critically endangered, only 800 left in the whole world, including animals in human care and in their natural habitat. And like tigers, we've got Amur tigers here at the zoo, and these are the animals that you think of when you think of a zoo. Actually, pollinators and plant grow fly, and especially the monarch butterfly, we've gotten such a wonderful response from the community for this project. And we are so excited to offer this project to the community to let people know there is something easy that everybody can do to help save pollinators. We have talked to thousands in the community, and I've heard hundreds of stories of people who have seen roosting sites of monarch butterflies in their backyards and pine trees growing up, and there's a longing to see the monarch butterfly more. There's a nostalgic feeling about monarchs.
There really is. They are so beautiful and so recognizable that I think that's why many people connect with them, because there's no question what you're seeing when you see them float by on that wind.
I actually saw a roosting site in Winterset last year. Have you ever seen a roosting site?
I have, actually, up in Ames, Iowa. It's been several years ago now, but it was in pine trees. They tend to roost a lot in that type of tree, and there were probably hundreds at that time frame.
So let's go ahead and start talking about the importance of these pollinators and what we can do to help ensure that they continue to thrive. And that is exactly why we created Plant Grow Fly. So the mission of Plant Grow Fly is to increase habitat for pollinators through education, collaboration, and action. Action is the key word there. As a zoo, we've got 500,000 people in our audience. We can't just educate folks anymore about the environmental problems happening. We want to encourage people to take action. And it's actually pretty easy to act for pollinators, as we'll get into. So let's move on to talk about, well, what are pollinators? What is pollination? Basically, pollinators are any animal that spreads pollen between plants, helping them to reproduce and thrive. Iowa's most common pollinators include insects such as butterflies and bees.
A lot of people don't know, Jessie, too, though, that many bat species are actually pollinators. Not so much here in Iowa, but across the world.
Yes, I love that. And we have Egyptian fruit bats here at the zoo, and they are pollinators in their natural habitat. So go ahead and think about what different kinds of pollinators call Iowa home, and jot those answers down, and we'll pause for just about 30 seconds. Okay, so you've got your answers jotted down, and let's meet the common pollinators that we have here in Iowa and the Midwest. So the first one is bees, and they really do the heavy lifting of pollination. You can see that their bodies are made to attract pollen. They're fuzzy all over. They're actually the most important group of pollinators. Female bees collect nectar and pollen from flowers for food for their offspring, and they transfer large quantities of pollen from flower to flower. Both male and female bees feed on nectar, a delicious sugary treat, but only the females gather pollen to take back to the nest. Many bees have specialized hair that is branched to help trap the pollen, and some also have pollen baskets.
That's my favorite, are the little pollen baskets.
I love those close-up pictures where you can see the little pollen baskets just bursting
Mm-hmm.
with pollen. They're curved, long, fringed hairs on their hind legs for pollen and nectar to stick to their legs. Yep. And it takes between 15 to 35 trips, with the bee visiting approximately 75 flowers each trip.
75 flowers?
Can you imagine?
That's a lot of work.
For one mason bee to gather enough pollen for just one egg equals 1,875 flower visits for just one egg.
One egg.
Yes. Bees are categorized as solitary or social, and we've got 4,000 species of bees in North America. 90% are solitary. And how many species of bees would you think we have in Iowa?
I'm gonna guess about 400.
About 300 plus,
Oh,
yes.
I'm pretty close.
Yes, you are pretty close. And this beautiful picture was provided by Nathan Brockman at Ryan. So let's get this less liked pollinator out of the way right away. They do provide a very important ecological service as pollination. Wasps are typically carnivorous during their larval stage, feeding on insect prey provided by their mothers. As adults, they switch to nectar, rotting fruit, or even things that humans have accidentally left out, like
soda pop. Yep.
sugary treats. Wasps typically have short tongues and can't reach deep inside some flowers. Many wasps are smooth-bodied, but some have hair and more or less incidental pollinators, carrying and dropping a few pollen grains as they move between flowers. So they're accidental pollinators.
Correct.
Yep.
Yep.
So we know examples of these as yellow jackets and hornets and paper wasps. And we'll go ahead and move on to a more liked pollinator now.
I like them. They're all right. They're all right. They have their place.
Okay, so butterflies are not the most important pollinator. I also call them accidental pollinators.
They are.
But they consume only nectar as adults. And while butterflies are fuzzy enough for pollen to stick to them, they have very long tongues called the proboscis, which we both love that word, I know.
I do. I like to say it. Proboscis, proboscis, proboscis.
And that allows them to probe deeply into the flower for nectar. And bypassing the anthers with the pollen, even so, they do contribute to some accidental pollination. And so these are the most recognized pollinators in the world. And another beautiful, beautiful picture there. Okay, so we'll move on to moths. They also don't actively gather pollen, but while foraging for nectar, pollen grains do accidentally get stuck on their body, and they're a little bit fuzzier than butterflies, so they're going to be a little bit more efficient pollinators and spreading pollen among the flowers.
And I think that's one, Jessie, that a lot of people don't think about because we don't see moths as often as we see butterflies, just simply given the time of day or night that they come out versus butterflies. But they're just as important.
That's exactly right. And one of my favorite moths is the hawk moths or the sphinx moths. We have a lot of those at Blank Park Zoo, and they really love those red flowers right outside the eagle exhibit. And they're just amazing, amazing animals. Next, flies are important pollinators.
Flies?
Yes, they are important pollinators. And a lot of people who look at this picture might think that that's a little bee. Flies belong to one of the largest orders of insects on Earth, 120,000 different species. And they're among the most frequent visitors to flowers. Some are pollinators and some are not, but they're often misidentified as bees or wasps. Flies have very short clubbed antennae, and some examples are the bee fly, the small-headed fly, the house fly. And flies are responsible for what favorite treat that kids love and adults love? Do you remember?
I don't remember. Chocolate.
Chocolate. Yep, yep. And that's one that
Yep.
kids always love that tidbit. Let's move on to beetles. This is actually one of my favorite pollinators. I think they're just absolutely gorgeous, the iridescent colors.
Mm-hmm.
They represent the greatest diversity of pollinators with over 30,000 species in North America.
Yeah, beetles are one of the biggest insect groups just overall throughout the world as well.
Many beetle species do feed on nectar and pollen. And this is my favorite part. Fossil records indicate that beetles and flies were some of the first insect pollinators of flowering plants around 150 million years ago. And they pollinated magnolias and water lilies.
Awesome.
So flowers that are pollinated primarily by beetles often give off specific odors to attract them.
That's true for a lot of pollinators and a lot of insects. Either the colors and or the smells will help attract them to their particular food source, nectar source, and or pollen sources.
Some flowers actually have a little landing pad.
They do, yes.
And a landing pad for pollinators to come down and be more efficient at pollinating that plant. And then after that plant is pollinated, that landing pad disappears.
So can we see that landing pad?
I don't think so.
Nope. Not unless you have ultraviolet vision.
A lot of baby birds have a little landing pad inside their mouth as well for the mamas and, to feed them worms. I just really love that. Okay, here's another favorite pollinator, hummingbirds. Of course, we have the ruby-throated hummingbird here in Iowa. And at this recording, it is early spring, and I have already seen a couple hummingbirds in my backyard. Have you?
I have as well. I just saw one the other day. I thought it was actually one of the hawk moths, but after I watched it for a while, it was actually a hummingbird.
They are so gorgeous. They're able to pollinate plants with long tubular blossoms, and the shape and types of these blossoms make it difficult for some other pollinators like bees and larger pollinators to reach the pollen deep within the flower. And hummingbirds do love red, they're just gorgeous. So why do we need pollinators? Why are they so important? Basically, let's ask that question. What percentage of the global food supply do pollinators help produce? And we'll give you about 30 seconds. Okay, so you have your answer jotted down, and it's about 30%. It's about 1/3 of our global food supply depends on pollinators. And that's 75% of flowering plants. And, when we talk about conservation issues, many times we talk about how it affects humans, how it affects us.
Right.
What are the foods that we eat that we're going to lose when pollinators decline? But as a zoo conservationist, I always like to point out that even though humans may not be eating all of those fruits and seeds and nuts and roots that are really helped produced by animal pollinators, the rest of the animal kingdom is. From songbirds to grizzly bears, pollinators are essential to the ecosystem. They're foundational to the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, everything's about food webs. And so, whether it's a direct consumption or an indirect consumption, it goes up the chain, if you will. And so many animals rely on, in fact, all animals rely on some level of pollination in their food webs.
Exactly, and pollinators are food themselves for other animals.
Yes, of course.
Many of the common songbirds that we see in our backyards in Iowa depend on on pollinators as an important food source. I think it's the chickadee from hatching the egg to fledging the nest, which is only a very short period of time, will be fed 6,000 to 9,000 insects.
Isn't that crazy?
And over 90% of those are the nutritious, juicy, protein-packed caterpillars. And without pollinators, many of these food items would be simply off the menu.
Which ones would you be sad to see?
I would really be sad to see cherries go. And my daughter would cry if she couldn't have watermelon on a very regular basis.
Oh, really?
And broccoli.
I think strawberries would be my hardest. I'm not much of a coffee drinker, so I'm probably one of the few that wouldn't be too sad there. But many people, of course, love their morning coffee.
We need to pause a second so I can take another big gulp of my coffee.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so we can talk also about the ecosystem services of pollinators. They're vital to the functioning of the entire ecosystem. They're essential in wildlife food webs. As I talked about, they're food for other animals. They directly and indirectly affect the diet of wildlife and the production of oxygen as they help those plants grow. And they indirectly aid in the stabilization of soil and decrease erosion as well. So important to the ecosystem. And we can't talk about pollinators without talking about the economy. The annual value of global crops directly affected by pollinators in the U.S. was 235 to 577 billion. That's quite a range.
That is quite a range.
But
and I can't, for one, wrap my brain around billions of dollars, but it's a lot.
Especially not 577 billion. So yes, it is a lot. And 75% of the world's food crops depend at least in part on animal pollination. So I think maybe we have made the point that they are extremely, extremely important.
I think so.
So what threats do pollinators face? Take a few seconds and jot down your ideas. Why are pollinators declining? When you think about why pollinators are threatened, a lot of the usual suspects are up here, and we could be talking about giraffe or rhinos or tigers. When we say global climate change, that is a game changer. When we talk about disease, talk about loss of habitat and feeding resources, basically all kinds of animals around the globe are feeling that pressure. But when we talk about pollinators especially, they are under threat from some modern agricultural and landscaping practices.
I'm going to interrupt you just for a quick second, Jessie. Who was that beautiful little black rhino that you had a picture of earlier on?
That beautiful little black rhino was Kamara, our new baby eastern black rhino.
Excellent. Thank you. Just in case you wanted to know her name.
And so we're talking about why pollinators are threatened. And when we look up at all of those different reasons, we thought that one thing that individual people or organizations, communities, school groups, families could really mitigate is the loss of habitat and feeding resources. And so that's what we're really focusing on.
Yeah.
And basically, Iowa was covered in over 90% the eastern tallgrass prairie, one of the biodiverse hotspots on this planet just a few hundred years ago.
I think that's one thing a lot of people don't know when we think prairie, because we haven't lived in the time of true, complete prairie areas and with high biodiversity to it. We don't really get the concept of what that looked like. You know, we have a few remnant prairies here and there, but they just haven't been around long enough anymore to really feel exactly what the diversity meant for the insect populations, the bird populations, small mammal populations, and just the level and variety of the plant populations too within those original prairies.
Exactly. When I close my eyes and think of a biodiverse hotspot, I think of the coral reef, or I think of rainforests and, you know, the Amazon. And Iowa was that biodiverse a few hundred years ago.
Correct.
I just read a book about the westward expansion, and it talked about when the settlers first came through and plowed the prairie for the first time, it sounded like pistol shots when it cut through the roots of the prairie plants, because they had been growing for so long and they were so deep and healthy. And so you're right, you know, very little of that remains. Less than 1/10 of our original prairie remains.
And it's really thank you to those prairies that Iowa has also been an agricultural area, because those prairies provided such beautiful soil.
And so that is why Iowa has the designation of the most converted landscape in the nation, because of the tallgrass prairie, because of the amazing black rich soil that all of those plants made for us. But it's really development of all kinds. So we're not just talking about agriculture.
Correct.
We're not just talking about farm fields. We're talking about urban sprawl, cities, towns, roads, really are creating formidable challenges for our pollinators. But if we looked at these pictures and we were talking about rhinos or giraffe or tiger, we would say there's no place for those animals to exist. It's hopeless. But when we look at these pictures and we think about pollinators like the monarch butterfly, there's actually a lot of hope in this picture. The monarch butterfly can survive on its only host plant, the milkweed plant, growing up between the cracks in the sidewalk, and that development can grow. Milkweed and monarchs can survive in backyard gardens and front yard gardens, in utility byways, in the unfarmable areas, in the farm homesteads that you see, in all of those ditches. And so there's actually a lot of hope in that picture for pollinators.
There is, because look at all those backyards that people could just, if they just put out a few pots or a little bit of, give a little bit of their backyards to a tiny little garden, it would make a huge difference collectively.
It really does make a huge difference. And we're never going to go back to a state covered in over 90% the tallgrass prairie. And we're proud of our agricultural heritage and the heritage of Iowa. And so how can we meet in the middle and put some of this habitat back in the landscape for these very important pollinating insects to survive? And so that's what Plant Grow Fly is all about. So what are we asking people to do, Ange?
Well, it's pretty simple, really. We kind of led into this, and really all they need to do is provide what we call pollinator pit stops or pollinator gas stations. And just like, regular gas stations, you stop and fill up. And that is what we are asking people to do here, is just to plant as few of plant as just a couple of plants in their backyard, or pots on their porch, or pots out their back deck, so that they can provide a host plant as well as nectar plants.
And one of the leading scientists in this field is Doug Tallamy. He's an author, and he wrote the book Bringing Nature Home. A lot of master gardeners and others that are watching this webinar will be familiar with him, I'm sure. If you're not, I really encourage you to read his book. And he talks about how all of the backyards and front yards, all of our lawns in America put together, are many times larger than all of our state and national parks put together.
Wow.
And literally, there is just not enough space for wildlife in the U.S., and this is a global problem as well, anymore. And so we have got to start looking at our lawns in a different way and what kind of benefit they can provide for wildlife, because we are a part of nature and we are not separate from it.
Correct.
So everybody can get a pollinator pit stop,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have to be a new bed. You can add these very special plants to existing landscaping as well.
Correct. Yep. Hey, just as a quick side note, didn't he come and speak at the zoo?
He sure did. And so you can go on Blank Park Zoo's YouTube channel and look up Doug Tallamy, and his last name is Tallamy, and you can see an amazing talk that he talks about the importance of native plants. And really what he does is he partners with the National Wildlife Federation, and you can go on the National Wildlife Federation's website and put in your zip code, and it will list native plants in order of benefit to native wildlife. So if I put in my zip code, which is Norwalk, Iowa, then it will tell me that, for instance, goldenrod, a native plant, is one of the top plants that I can plant because it provides ecological benefits to all of these native animals in Iowa, and is a host plant for butterflies and things like that.
That is an amazing resource.
Yes.
That is so simple.
Yes. And oak trees are also going to be very high on the list for many of us, because they're a host plant for all of the oak species put together, are host plants for over 500 species of insects. It's
Isn't
amazing.
that crazy? We
Yes.
don't think about trees so much
Yes.
as being host plants for insects, but they certainly are.
Yes. And so really one of our mantras at Plant Grow Fly is no effort is too small. And you can see this tiny little monarch caterpillar who is feeding on a milkweed plant, and he or she is so glad that that little plant and that maybe it's a little garden that we're looking at has provided the critical resources that they need. So to be an official Plant Grow Fly garden, all you need at the very least is one host plant off of our list and one nectar plant off of our list. So even if you have just one host plant and one nectar plant in a pot, you can provide a gas station for pollinators to fill up. And it could be as small as a single pot on your porch, like you said, Ange, or even a schoolyard garden, or as large as an entire prairie restoration. So let's talk about what plants. And feel free, folks who are watching this, to take out your phone and snap a picture. Also, these brochures are available on our website. All this information is on our website, blankparkzoo.com, or you can just Google Plant Grow Fly.
So let's be specific about what is a nectar plant versus a host plant, Jessie.
So a nectar plant is a plant that produces nectar, and nectar is food for adult butterflies.
Very good.
And for many other kinds of pollinators, of course. And a host plant is the nursery for butterflies. It is the plant, for instance, Monarch's host plant is milkweed, and so the adult butterfly can only lay its eggs on a milkweed plant, and the caterpillar can only eat the milkweed plant. There's lots of different kinds of native milkweed in Iowa, and they will use all of them. But we'll talk about some of our favorites for backyard gardens, because that really is kind of the niche of plant grow fly. And so when you're looking at this list, we've been talking about native plants. We've probably said that about 20 times already. And you might be surprised to see a couple non-native plants on here. And so that would be lantana and zinnias and cosmos. And the reason why they're on here is because they're prolific nectar producers. Pollinators love them, and they're not invasive. So I think most people probably know what invasive means, but do we want to talk about what invasive means?
Yeah, I think that's important because there's so many plants that are sold at garden spots that may not be considered native, and they can take over. And so an invasive plant is basically one that's going to outcompete the native plants. And invasive plants oftentimes also take up more resources. They take more watering, they take more care. Where native plants, once they're planted, and if you are making it into a perennial type garden, they'll within a few years pretty much care for themselves.
Yeah, they'll take a lot less maintenance and kind of just a different mindset. And you know, a lot of the common species that we see in front yard gardens and backyard gardens and corporate landscaping are invasive, like the butterfly bush and honeysuckle and the tree of heaven and the pear trees that you see everywhere. And they do invade these natural areas. They invade the woodlands, and they outcompete the native plants. So unfortunately, in early spring, when you're walking through the woodlands here in Iowa, a lot of the green stuff that you see is going to be honeysuckle, and it's going to be those things that are blooming before the other plants, you know, outcompeting them for sunlight and for resources. And so it's important. We would never put an invasive plant on our species list.
Correct.
But the reason why we have a couple non-natives is because gardeners are generally very used to using these very used to using these species. They're prolific nectar producers, and oftentimes they will bloom much earlier, and they'll bloom longer, and they'll bloom later, and so they can extend the resources that you have in your garden. And of course, a good butterfly garden has a lot of diversity, and so try not to just pick one of these plants, but you can take this information right to your local greenhouse. And we do have lots of resources on our website of companies and greenhouses that will have these types of plants, and so you can check that out. So here's our list of nectar plants.
It's also helpful to plant so that you have some early bloomers and some midsummer bloomers, as well as some later blooms. And we'll come into that a little bit here in a little while as we talk about the migration of specifically the monarch.
Yes, that's a very good point. And you will see in this information that we have all the information that you need to know: how tall it's going to get, how wide it's going to get, and when it blooms, and other important information that you need to know. And we did just add a couple trees to it because we partner with Trees Forever, and the Eastern Redbud tree and the Serviceberry tree are fantastic. You know, butterfly gardens need to be in full sun, so don't plant those trees right around your butterfly garden.
Good point.
Yeah, but they are really important nectar plants. Okay, so we're going to move on to the host plants. Again, these are the plants that the caterpillars will eat and the adult butterflies will lay their eggs on. You'll see milkweed on there for the monarch butterfly. And let's just say a little bit more about milkweed. Of course, common milkweed is the one that everybody is used to seeing in the ditches. It is also a plant that has a major PR problem.
Yeah, it doesn't help that it's called a weed
to start with. It's called a weed. And can you talk a little bit about what farmers had to do for years and years?
Yeah, for a long time. I can remember even when I was a kid, it was not uncommon that you had to go walk rows and pull milkweed out. And so it was competing in agriculture with the farmed type plants that they wanted to see. And so it does have a PR problem because it was taking up some resources. It was taking up literal ground.
But the important part of the story is that we can kind of let that go now
Mm-hmm.
because of modern agricultural practices, and we're specifically talking about spraying applications on fields. Milkweed is not going to invade the field rows anymore. It's not
Correct.
going to invade the fields. So we can be comfortable with it in ditches and in non-farmable areas and on fence rows
Right.
and on homesteads. And you'll find out later why we need to put so much milkweed back into the landscape, but we do not need to worry about it invading field farms anymore.
And even within, you were talking about non-tillable or non-production agricultural areas. There's, oftentimes a little spot here and a little spot there that for whatever reason isn't tillable, and that's a perfect spot.
Mm-hmm.
Those are perfect areas for to let milkweed come back.
And common milkweed will generally come back very easily.
Yep.
Now, when you're talking about a backyard garden, some people put common milkweed in their backyard. I do, but not everybody is up for that. Some folks have called common milkweed in a backyard garden like putting a bowl in a china shop, and I love that because
I do too.
Think about the tall grass prairie. It is biodiverse, it is thick, the plants are tall, and all of those plants have to be aggressive to get sunlight, to get water, to get contact with the soil. And so that's why some of these plants act like this. And we're not used to plants acting like that in your garden.
Well, for some, as you said, some people don't like it in their backyards. It's why I planted in my backyards, because I am what you would call lazy when it comes to taking care of my property, etc. But that's okay. It doesn't mean that it doesn't look great still.
Yeah.
I still trim back what I don't want, those kind of things. But some of these, especially the common milkweed, is actually very easy to put in place.
It is. And what we're really talking about, as many people know, it just spreads easily.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're not up for that kind of adventure, we really recommend that you put in butterfly weed, which is a different kind of milkweed. It's a little bit shorter. It's got beautiful orange blooms.
Oh, they do have pretty blooms.
Oh, it's one of my favorite plants. Also swamp milkweed. It's kind of a misnomer. You don't need overly wet areas. And it is a little bit taller, not quite as tall as common milkweed, has pink blooms and smells like cotton candy.
It does.
I have a lot of it in my yard, and last summer, literally every day, unless it was raining, there were multiple monarchs all over it. It's an amazing plant.
And that particular plant doesn't look quite like what we envision milkweed to look like. It has thinner leaves, etc. So it's a daintier plant.
It is. It is just gorgeous. And there's also a couple other like purple milkweed and world milkweed. There's lots of different choices. So don't think that you have to have common milkweed in your backyard to support the monarchs. And you'll see some other interesting plants here, like the herbs are very important host plants, which is kind of surprising to some folks. We've got the oak tree, which we talked about. And don't forget about the native grasses. They're going to be really important host plants for well. And they add just kind of a different angle, like a different ecological niche to your garden. You need lots of different types of plants. Higher diversity in your plants will equal higher diversity of pollinators that will find the resources that they need.
Correct. I'm going to jump in here too, and just for a quick second, talk about why a same species of insect in this case would need a different nectar plant compared to a different host plant. And that's simply so the adults don't outcompete their own offspring. And so not only are they food sources, both are food sources, but they're food sources for different stages of one particular or any particular insect in this case. And so I think that is fantastic that nature figures that all out, right?
I think it is too. And a lot of insects will have multiple host plants, and some others are more specialized and they just have one host plant, like the monarch.
Like the monarch.
Yes, very interesting. Okay, so there's our host plant list. Hopefully you snapped a picture of that as well. And don't forget, you can go to the zoo's website and find all of the resources. So let's talk about how to plant a butterfly garden. And I know a lot of you listening are going to have tons of experience with gardening already. So we're going to really try to highlight for you what makes butterfly gardening different from more, say, traditional gardening. And so the first thing is consider your space. Of course, most of these plants, and I want to mention here, I always like to say, Angela, you hear me say this on almost a daily basis. Don't let perfection be the enemy of good. And what I mean by that is we're going to go through all of these, bullet points of what makes a good butterfly garden. And if you can't do all of these, it is still going to be a good resource for the butterflies.
Yeah, my backyard is a perfect example of that. I have pretty mature trees, and so I have more shade than I have sun. So I have just a few specific spots that I can actually plant for a butterfly or a pollinator garden specifically. And so it's not perfect because I would like more, but I just don't quite have that backyard right now.
Yeah, and so you can just plant some of these little plants scattered around your yard. It doesn't need to be all together. The pollinators do not care.
Nope, they'll find it.
Yes, and speaking of shade plants, if you do want more shade plants, because all the plants that we talked about basically are sun plants, you can go on the zoo's website and we have a link to a document with shade plants. Okay, so sunny is a great place to put your butterfly garden, and what we mean by sunny is 6 hours of sun per day or more. Of course, nice rich black soil is going to be best, but these native plants are going to be very hardy, and they are well suited to lots of different soil types and generally are going to be able to be planted in lots of different kinds of soil types. And so that's really, may take them a little bit longer to get going, but that's something really great about a lot of these native plants. Plant it somewhere where you can enjoy it, because it's gonna have interest and insects, visitors, and even in the winter time, if you leave the stalks up, it's going to provide something to look at. It's great for the whole family to enjoy. And when considering your space, also try to find a wind-sheltered area. If you're new at this, consider starting small and expanding over time. I always recommend that.
Yeah, it's like so many things, build your confidence.
Okay, so the next is choose your plants. Butterflies and other pollinators are going to really love a variety of different colors, a variety of heights to create those little ecological niches inside your garden. If you want to, put your host plants in the middle of the garden because they're kind of like the nursery, this will give your caterpillars and your eggs more protection from predators and from wind and rain. You want to have plants that bloom throughout the entire growing season, like we mentioned earlier, because some insects are going to need the nectar and the host plants in the spring, some in the summer, some in the fall. And you want to make sure the plants that you get are native, non-cultivars if possible, and chemical-free. And so that is kind of a hard one. These are different kinds of plants. If you go to a big box store and you buy a plant, the folks who are selling you the plants may not know what kind of treatments have been applied to the plant. And if a treatment such as neonicotinoids has been applied, sometimes it's put on the plant in a systemic manner, which means that it could be present within the plant for its entire life.
Correct.
I did ask Doug telling me this very question, because a lot of people are a little bit intimidated by trying to find organic plants, and it is a little bit harder. And he said that, I said, is it still okay if someone wants to go to just a corporate place to buy a plant and it's treated with neonicotinoids? And he said that likely it will wear off, and it still is better to get people taking that action, getting their hands dirty, getting those plants in the ground. But for folks who are in the know, please try to go to one of our approved greenhouses on our website and try to, go to the local plant sales. Master Gardener has plant sales, and find those real native plants to Iowa that we know are chemical free, because we need to make sure that your butterfly garden is an oasis, a sanctuary, a safe place for these insects. And these chemicals are not going to know which insect to kill and which insect not to kill.
Correct. I think that's the hard thing here, is because we are such a society of having manicured lawns, and this can still look very kept and very beautiful, but those simple treatments, it's not like you can pick and choose.
Exactly. And, since butterfly gardening and native gardening has become more popular, now they're starting to make crazy cultivars of these native plants. And you'll find butterfly weed in all kinds of crazy colors. And again, they're going to probably provide some benefits to the pollinators, but as the breeding process of plants continues, many times they are selected for beauty and for smelling good to humans.
Right, which is not the same thing as smelling good to the insects.
Yeah, and so in that process, a lot of the, we'll say, nutrition for the pollinators will be lost. And so just keep that in mind, and that's why we want to get these real native plants. And native is best, and I think that we have talked about this a lot, so we'll just talk shortly about this. Don't ever put fertilizers or pesticides. They do not require that like some of the other plants we're used to putting in our yards. They'll require less water after they get established because they are well suited to the climate conditions and the soil and the precipitation that we get here in Iowa. And they're not just going to help pollinators, they're going to help all the other native critters.
It also helps your yard too, because the root systems tend to be deeper. And so the reason they require that less water is because the root systems can go deeper and take up the water. But that also means that it's taking care of the soil and it's providing some root web, if you will, that's going to add some sustainability to that soil.
And this is what it's all about, promoting biodiversity. Biodiversity makes our ecosystem work well. When biodiversity declines, the ecosystem is less able to provide services that not only the pollinators need, but humans and everybody needs. And so we get this question a lot. Should we start with seeds or starter plants? Well, of course, it depends on your budget and where you want to put this garden. Seeds are cheaper. And I do like casting seed and then having that adventure, I like to say, of figuring out, is that a native plant that I want or is that a weed? But not everybody is up for that. And there is I feel a less of a success rate by casting seed. But if you want to buy plugs or starter plants, which we see here is a little milkweed plant, they're going to be more expensive, but you're going to know what that plant looks like so you can help care for it a little bit better from the beginning.
As someone who is not a green thumber by nature, I like to plant plugs just for those reasons, because then I know what I'm starting with, I know what I've planted, I know where I've planted it, and then I can tell the difference between that beginning plant and the true weeds that I need to go ahead and pull.
Exactly. And in my garden in Norwalk, I've got a prairie patch in our backyard that's about 30 feet long and about 20 feet wide. We've got about 150 different plants, about 30 different species. And what we did was we put in mostly plugs and then cast a few species of seeds in broad kind of swoops around the garden. And then from the beginning, I had about 5 species of weeds. And I just figured out what the weeds looked like, and I let everything else go until it got bigger so I could identify it.
Yes.
And I mean, that is like what I consider super fun. And I think a lot of people that are listening to this webinar get it too. Yeah. But if you can get overwhelmed easily if you're not familiar with native plants and you cast seed. So also, many people have probably heard this saying, but especially with seed and native plants, the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, and the third year they leap. But they're not really sleeping and creeping those first couple of years. For every 1 foot of native plant that you see above the ground, there is 3 feet of roots.
Isn't that crazy?
Underground.
The root systems are amazing. I wish I could grow them upside down because I'm kind of a freak. I like the root systems. They're really interesting and so amazing that they go that deep.
And the UNI Tallgrass Prairie Center has some really great graphics on the root systems.
Yeah, they really do. And many nature centers throughout Iowa now are displaying some of those root systems so that you can understand just how deep they can go.
Yes.
Some of the root systems on the original tallgrass prairies can go 14 feet deep, which is crazy.
It is. Okay, so we've said this a couple times, but please don't apply any chemicals on your habitats and try to avoid them on your yard. I know that's something that's hard for people to let the dandelions grow and things like that, but it is a shift in mindset.
It is.
That we just, it causes problems for both human health and wildlife health and the health of the water. And a really good resource that talks about this is the UNI Good Neighbor Program. And they can even provide provide signage for your yard so your neighbors know why the dandelions are growing.
Yep.
And I've said, I'm not just talking about dandelions, but we're just talking about really thinking critically about the chemical use in your yards. Way more chemicals per square foot are used in yards than in farm fields, and we need to start really being a little bit more cognizant of the things that we're adding to our landscapes, our yards. So please avoid using pesticides and herbicides. And if you do have some kind of pest problem, we recommend vinegar, mineral oil, and soap. They're safer alternatives. And what I have found in my garden is that if I have some kind of pest, if you just usually, if you just wait a little longer, some other kind of insect is going to come by and knock it down.
Munch on it.
Yep. So let nature take its course.
A simple thing that I found that works pretty well is just going a little old school. And so for getting rid of those weeds we don't like to see in the sidewalk cracks, etc., I just use hot water treatments and boil hot water and dump it on there. And it might take a couple of treatments to get them to die back, but it works fairly well. And then if you just keep them pulled from there, initially in the spring, I have to do several treatments. And then throughout the rest of the summer, I can just do a little spot pulling and it keeps them down.
And I'll add one quick caveat to that. We are not in any way advocating that you let invasive species spread and grow. So if you've got some of those aggressive invasive species, woody species in your ditches and things like that, we know that you have to treat those. But really what you and I, Good Neighbor program, and what we are advocating for is to avoid the blanket spraying and just, take a little bit of more time to think about what we're adding to the landscape. Okay, so now the fun part. After you get your plants, you've planned your garden, you know what soil you have, it's a sunny area plant. Get your friends together. This is a wonderful picture of some folks at a retirement community. You can do it with your family, and it's something that is just really, really fun to go out and accomplish and get your hands dirty.
I love this picture too because it's a raised bed in this case. So, you certainly can make this fit your space and what your needs are.
Exactly. Okay, so what other pollinator-friendly practices and enhancements could you use in your garden? Go ahead and jot a few things down and we'll pause for just a little bit. Okay, let's talk about other things that pollinators love. One thing is basking spots. And basically all this is a dry rock or slate stone in your garden. And pollinators will use this to warm up in the cool mornings, warm up after a rain. And this is something that they really enjoy. Winter shelter. This is really important.
This is another shift of mindset.
We really encourage people to not cut down their gardens in the fall. Because when everyone is out doing their yard work to get ready for the harsh Iowa winters, native bees especially are already hunkered down in your garden, and they are already hunkered down inside the dead stems of your grasses and your plants, and that's where they will overwinter. Not everybody gets to go to Mexico like the monarch butterfly.
I don't get to go to Mexico in the winter either.
Exactly. So we really encourage people, if you need to do garden cleanup, to do it just right around Mother's Day. And what I do is I'll a lot of the stuff I just let go year after year, and it just naturally kind of decomposes and goes back to the ground. But if there are some stalks that I want to cut back to let the new shoots come up, then I do about 1/3 of the garden, and then a few days later, and I let the stems lay on the ground so everybody has enough time to evacuate. Then I do the other third and the other third. And that's really important. And that's something that is, maybe not everybody's comfortable doing that and how it looks, but it does provide a lot of interest and a lot of habitat in the wintertime for animals too.
And that kind of goes along, another practice that goes along with this is leaves as well in the fall. I've compromised in my household, and we do kind of a cleanup in the general yard, but anything over top of gardens, anything near the gardens, we leave the leaves down because that too helps provide those habitat areas.
Exactly. Mineral salts, this can just be a little muddy area that you just kind of let be muddy in your garden, and that will provide resources for butterflies to do a behavior called puddling, where sometimes you have seen, like especially swallowtails alongside of the road, kind of drinking the puddle water. And then sweet treats. And what we mean by that is like a nectar feeder or some rotting fruit. Keep in mind, this might attract the less liked pollinator a little bit. So use that one sparingly.
Yep. So those we just put further out. So if I don't want them in my patio area, we hang them on our back fence.
Exactly. and maintaining your garden. So really, we talked about the sleep, creep, and leap, and that translates to basically after 3 years, your native bed should become what we call established, and that the native plant should start choking out the annual weeds. And from experience, this really does happen, and it's exciting when it happens. And it's happening in my yard right now. And I can see all the plants getting big, and the weeds don't stand a chance. So those first 3 years, though, you need to make sure you keep your plants nicely watered. Of course, when you put new plants in, they need a lot of water. And just for the first 3 years, just make sure they don't get overly dry. If it's a normal summer, I don't know if we have normal summers anymore, but if we get normal precipitation, I don't have to water my butterfly gardens at all now, once they're established. Control weeds, especially the first 3 years. And we do this by hand weeding. You can mulch if you want to, but make sure that you get chemical-free mulch, organic mulch, and use it sparingly because, you probably want the plants to reseed and they're going to need that contact with the soil.
Yeah, correct. Now, a lot of my butterfly plants or pollinator plants are in pots, and so I do have to water a little bit more than I do in the areas that are planted into the actual ground.
Yes. And of course, avoid herbicides. Again, we've said that already. Ange, I'm going to let you do this one.
I'm not sure I can say it. When we put this together, we were dying laughing over the fact that you need to be tolerant. The whole point of host plants is so that the larval stages, the caterpillar stages, can eat them. And so that's another reason to put some of those host plants in the center of your garden, is because they may not look the prettiest if they're doing their job. And so if you put them amongst some of the other plants, then that helps to cover that look. I'll try to say this without flubbing it. In other words, you need to be magnanimous regarding multitudes of mandibles munching. I did it.
You did it. You did it well, but still, we have not included the word masticating.
We were not going to include the word masticating. That's why it's not up there. Okay. That one's too hard to say.
Okay, so we talked about the ecosystem services of pollinators. Now we can talk about the ecosystem service of gardens, and we've really insinuated this before, but it's food and coverage for all the animals, and it absorbs rainwater, filtration through the root systems. They're just very, very important. And we can all do this. We can all do this at any scale.
It's easy.
Small or large, everybody can do it. So after you plant your garden, you can register it with Plant Grow Fly. It's a free 5-minute online form at our website, and you get to tell us what plants you used, where your garden is, how big it is. We'll recognize you on the website, and you get to name your garden. Some of our favorite names are Bonsai Betty's Butterfly Bar and Garden of Whedon.
That's the one I love. I wish I would have come up with that. I'm not that brilliant.
And my garden, my daughter's name is Elena, so our garden is Elena's Bee and Butterfly Bed and Breakfast. And we also ask you what inspired you to plant your garden, and we get these really tug at the heartstrings kind of responses like, I just had a baby daughter and I want her to be a conservationist too. My grandma just passed away and she was a fantastic gardener. I want to carry on her legacy. And we find that this really is something that people feel very passionate about.
Yeah, very nice.
And you can even order a sign. So after you register with the garden, we'll recognize you on the website. We'll send you a little nifty certificate in the mail, and you'll be part of the Plant Grow Fly community. And I hope we have made it clear that native gardens do not need to look weedy. You can make them look traditional, ornamental, manicured. It's all in the way that you maintain it. Or if you broadcast a whole bunch of species of seed, it will look more wild, and it will look a little different from your neighbor's gardens. And so if that is a concern to you, you can order a sign, and that will, and I've had many conversations with my neighbors, and it's been a positive thing in our neighborhood. So far, we have 1,250 registered habitats.
That's amazing. And I'm noticing from this graphic, not just in Iowa.
Yes. So you might wonder how we have a garden in Louisiana. It's because we link to other region-specific garden recipes or other native plants of ecoregions throughout the United States on our website. And so we can register gardens throughout the U.S. And we're hoping to add gardens every single year. So many of you listening will already have a garden that would be approved by Plant Grow Fly. Please add some more of those special plants and please register it. Or if you're starting a new garden, please register it with Plant Grow Fly. And here's our website.
Yeah, you can see that the website has been put together so that it can answer almost any question you can come up with. You can see just an overview of plant growth fly, such as what we've talked about already. You can also see that you can find different partners. You can figure out how to create your garden, what maybe some plants you're looking at, maybe some ideas of how to put it together. There is just a plethora, as they say, of resource here that you can go to and help yourself with.
Everything you need to know. So we are going to start close by talking about an insect weighing less than a paperclip that takes one of the longest migrations on Earth. The monarch butterfly overwinters in the fir forest just west of Mexico City in ancient fir trees, and they gather in the thousands upon thousands around the trunks of trees to stay warm. Even though it's in Mexico, it's cool and it's quite high elevation. They do a kind of a half hibernation, and they might wake up just once or twice to get a little drink of water from the stream or to nectar from flowering plants. In early spring, around March, they wake up and start leaving their overwintering sites en masse. They find a partner to breed with, and they follow the bloom of milkweed through the central part of the United States through successive generations. The first generation might get to Texas, find milkweed, lay their eggs, and die. The second generation might get to Oklahoma, lay their eggs, and die, and so on. And through 4 or 6 or 7 generations or more, they end up in the Midwest throughout the summer, and the Midwest is the heart of the summer breeding range. Some monarchs in spring and fall will get all the way to Canada, and this is the really cool part. Nature tells them to produce the super generation. And these super butterflies are physiologically different from preceding generations. They have slightly elongated wings, meant to fly long distances. They're meant not to breed for a long time, and they're meant to live several months instead of just a couple weeks. And it has something to do with the shortening of days and the waning bloom of the milkweed. And then they turn their sights to Mexico, a place they've never been before, sometimes 3,000 miles away, a place that their great-great-great-great-grandparents have been, and they fly using the magnetic field of the Earth.
It's amazing.
When they arrive, it's around the Day of the Dead, and folklore in that area of Mexico says that it is the souls of their fallen ancestors returning to their homeland.
That's beautiful.
So here is the population status of the monarch. You can see that in the mid-90s, we had our peak at 44, almost 45 acres. In 2013, it got down to 1.6 acres. Now we've had an uptick in the population since. It has a lot to do with weather. It has a lot to do with all these efforts like Plant Grow Fly and Master Gardeners putting in more pollinator plants. But scientists say that we need to get up to over 30 acres of their overwintering habitat. This is how many acres the butterflies are inhabiting in Mexico. And so our work is not done yet. And really, the I-35 corridor that goes through Iowa is called the Monarch Flyway because it mirrors the monarch migration. And so when they're coming through northward in spring, your garden needs to have milkweed. When they're coming southward in fall, your garden needs to have plenty of nectar sources. And through this I-35 corridor, we have Canada, the United States, and Mexico all working together to help save this monarch butterfly and actually to help prove to the federal government that it does not need to be listed as endangered. And that might sound kind of counterintuitive. Iowa has created the Iowa Monarch Conservation Consortium, which is basically half agricultural groups and half environmental groups, all working to make sure that the monarch is not listed as endangered, because you cannot take an endangered species or kill an endangered species. And if it was listed, it would have huge ramifications for agriculture and other practices that are common in Iowa. And so we are working with the Iowa Consortium and many other organizations to put plans in place to put milkweed back in the landscape, because we know it takes 7 milkweed plants to get 1 monarch to Mexico. And so we can extrapolate exactly how much habitat needs to go in Iowa. And by the way, every state along the migration path is doing the same thing. It is really the bald eagle of this generation. And we're running out of time, so just real briefly, we're also going to talk about another pollinator-friendly practice that you can do.
Yeah, and this is how you mow. And you can go on to Monarch Joint Venture and find out more information. But basically, there's several different mowing practices. And what we're really talking about is if you own some reasonable size property. But I've enacted some of these just in my own small yard, where we mow a little less frequently. We let the mowing happen at a higher depth, if you will. So, and then especially for those ditch areas, excuse me, if you do have a rural property, those ditch areas, just to wait and mow those later on. Now, we're not talking safety issues. If you live where it's a safety issue to let the grasses go too high for, roadside visualizations, then you, of course, need to take care of that. But if you let them go to, what is it, just till about October, I believe, then not only are you helping the pollinators, you're also helping the ground nesting birds.
Exactly.
And so you're helping kind of several different layers of needed habitats.
And you can go to Monarch Joint Venture and learn more about how you can employ some pollinator-friendly mowing practices on your land. And there is some more information on mowing practices, and that is created by the University of Minnesota. And those are some of the management windows for the different parts of the U.S. So as we wrap up here, the Monarch Festival, we have it every year at the zoo. It's during the southern migration of the monarch butterfly, and we partner with the Latino Heritage Festival and celebrate the Iowa-Mexico connection. We've got Latino dancers, mariachi bands, puppet shows, and the culminating event of the day is the bug parade, where kids can dress up as their favorite insect and take a symbolic migration through the zoo. So please look on our website for the annual date of the festival. And we'll wrap up here by saying that everybody can help pollinators. Every single person can do something in their yard or at their place of work or at their church to put some of these special plants in the landscape.
Schoolyard.
We want to thank you for joining us today for this Plant Grow Fly webinar. We applaud the efforts of master gardeners and all the other folks who are listening to this webinar. Please add these plants. Please register it with Plant Grow Fly. Go to our website, which is up here. There's also our email. Like us on Facebook. And please don't be shy. Reach out to us anytime if you've got questions or know of additional ways that we can partner. Thank you so much from Plant Grow Fly at Blank Park Zoo. Angela, thank you so much for joining us.
This was a lot of fun. And as a last comment from myself, this is easy enough for everybody to do. So get the kids involved, get the grandparents involved, friends, neighbors, everybody.
Exactly. Happy planting. And thank you from Plant Grow Fly.